Carried. Thank you. So we move on to item 11 now, which is the Auckland Transport update. And the purpose of this item, as we realise, is to provide an update on the public transport patronage and today fair pricing issues and opportunity, the ongoing shortages of bus drivers and the performance of the PT network, which this committee has signalled as one of its top priorities. As I understand it, Mark, the presentation is going to kick off with the ferries. Is that correct? Okay, so I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the regular opportunity now to report into this committee on key issues of joint concern and what we're doing about it, and to have a good discussion and debate around these aspects. I'd like to introduce Derek Coper, who's our GM of Metro Services, our public transport network, and also Richard Harrison, who's our Manager for Public Transport Service Optimisation as well. We are, of course, in the process of responding to the Mayor's letter of expectation. We are preparing our statement of intent at the moment, and I would like to think we have started to look internally at how we can respond to a number of those key themes and requests, and starting to put in place some actions to improve that direction. For example, engaging better with local boards and elected members. Hopefully, you would have seen a significant enhancement to communications over the last few weeks, and that's one example we have focused on recently to try and improve and respond sooner rather than later to the letter of expectation. Today's discussion really is working with the Chair and Deputy Chair to set the agenda. It's focused on some key areas of opportunity and concern. So we will talk about ferry performance, bus driver shortage, public transport patronage, some recovery and enhancement opportunities that we are looking at and progressing. Use of PT data and planning, and I know that's been a question from a number of councillors, and I would like to, after this meeting, engage with each one of you as to whether you wish to have, and I know some of you do, a one-on-one deep dive into PT data, and particularly bus performance in your particular ward, so we can actually pick that apart a little bit. Also, we'll talk about the annual fare review, which is part of our proposed budget for FY24, but of course, given the events of recent weeks, we've deferred that at this point. So on that note, I'll hand over to Derek, who will talk through the ferries, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. Kia ora, everyone. It is fair to say that performance across ferry services with disruptions and cancellations is disappointing, especially with fullest crew shortage and vessel breakdowns. Our team is actively managing the operational aspects impacting customers and working on initiatives to improve customer experience. Ferry patronage recovered to pre-COVID levels, and it is our priority to maintain that growth with continued investment in ferries. Where performance is poor, we are working with operators to resolve and assess other formal options to improve performance and under those contracts to influence change. However, our principles are based on partnering approach. Across all ferry services, despite cancellations, there is sufficient capacity across all 80 contracted services, but there are capacity issues on the Devonport ferries when vessels are not fully crewed, leaving passengers behind, particularly in the peak. Full as we are possible, have been deploying a second vessel to pick up customers left behind, and it happens typically within 15 to 20 minutes where it is possible. This graph highlights we report separately on Devonport when the service became Auckland Transport Service under the gross contract arrangements. We at Devonport Services reported about 2% of trips that have had high loadings in the peak. Since early 2022, service delivery by Fullers 360 has been impacted by crew shortages, vessel reliability, and most recently the impacts of the Auckland flood and storm event. While Fullers 360 have had moderate success in increasing crew levels, their ability to recruit continues to be impacted, in part by availability of suitably qualified personnel within the New Zealand market. And this challenge is being experienced by all ferry operators in the Auckland region, with others filling the vacancies with crew from within the sector. Fullers currently operates 20 vessels across the range of 80 contracted services, the Waiheke route and other commercial services. For 80 contracted services, the peak ferry requirement is 15 vessels. Fullers also recently completed the purchase of 2 additional vessels included in the 20 that I mentioned from Explore Group to bolster their fleet. 4 vessels are now owned by Auckland Transport and are subject to planned refurbishment over the next 9 to 12 months. One of the vessels, Wanderer, is due to be completed by the end of February and is expected to be in service by April after sea trials and necessary crew recertifications. There are also 5 new hybrid and electric vessels being sourced, with 2 currently under construction for delivery in late 2024. Fullers schedule their vessels and crew across their network. There are no dedicated vessels and crews for the routes, as long as the vessels perform within the prescribed vehicle standards on each contract. Operational roster requires them to have 53 sets of crews to operate those 20 vessels. Full crew comprise of qualified skipper plus deckhands and onboard supervisors. Each vessel needs to have at least one master specifically trained for one vessel. And the size and capacity of the vessel dictates the number of deckhands and onboard supervisors required to operate the service safely and efficiently. There are currently 38 full sets of crew available, with a shortfall of about 15 sets, or 30% of the minimum required. This means that Fullers cannot cover any short-term unplanned engineering or crewing issues, with 2 fully backup vessels. In the interim, 5 return Gulf Harbour trips currently are being replaced by bus, diverting 1 vessel to provide some resilience for vessel maintenance and staff absentees, but also to provide some certainty for those customers from that area of getting of traveling on the day. And Fullers have also contracted a crew resource from the Explorer Group, who are trained on those vessels that they have purchased to operate those vessels on their behalf. And as you can see on the slide, currently we are still 36 individual crew members short for our contracted services. So in terms of cancellations, in December, until December, we saw, we have a slide later, we saw an improvement or reduction in the cancelled trips. However, in January, those cancelled trips show an increase with capacity issues on certain popular peak Devonport and Waiheke services. And just to note that Waiheke service is obviously exempt and non-contracted service. In terms of our recovery plan for improving ferry operations, Fullers have provided AT with recruitment plan and their talent strategy in August last year to address their crew shortage. They have undertaken the process to successfully gain accredited employer status under the work visa scheme, but report that employing from overseas markets is still complex, and the immigration and steps required for recognition of the overseas maritime qualifications limit the market. However, they have engaged external consultants, and they are in discussions with overseas resource and subject to immigration processes and personal circumstances of those looking to immigrate. They plan to recruit 10 qualified crew members. From my perspective, we also, Fuller's also have increased their pay to retain their staff and have refreshed their employee benefits, as well as have implemented a training program to upskill people from deckhands to more qualified positions to fulfill their requirements. From my perspective, we have regular meetings with Fuller's focus on issue resolutions, disruptions, communications, and alternative transport. We have deployed additional resources at Devonport, and we have dedicated additional resource to help resolve the current situation and complete that transition from under new contracts. And we are also engaging with ports of Auckland to minimize any additional disruptions from cruise ships or any other vessels entering the harbour outside of their scheduled times. We do have a contractual arrangements. We have payment deductions for services not meeting route performance minimum thresholds process, and we also have other contractual mechanisms to improve that customer experience. Cure plan is the last resort. We a formal process can enter. There are some thresholds to be achieved. To do that, if those shortfalls, for example, in crew are not achieved over a longer period of time. I must say, though, that just like with bus drivers, we've been working with all bus operators, including the ferry operators, on working together with them under the partnering principles to address the crew shortage across all public transport modes, and have lobbied central government where possible to support that. So in terms of those cancellations, as I mentioned, you can see that they have been reducing until end of December. We don't have data for January yet, but we know that those cancellations have increased. In terms of our process, we currently focus on working with Fuller's in particular to minimize those cancellations with proactive arrangements for alternative transport where possible, to provide some certainty to some ferry users. We have attended a meeting in Gulf Harbour late last year, taken on board some of their feedback. We also want to just note that reliability that we report is the contractual reliability. It's not the customer facing. So, for example, cancellations that you see are not are measured separately. They're not part of our reliability criteria. But Richard, my colleague here, will explain that shortly. We have work underway to improve our disruption communications, and we have a dedicated team now to focus on improving that and accelerating that transition from Fuller's largely managing that process previously to more AT-led disruption management using our tools, and we looking to do this as soon as possible. I now hand over to Richard to cover some of the other performance measures.
Thank you, Derek. Kia ora koutou. So I'm knowing that the committee is prioritising monitoring the ongoing performance of public transport through this crisis. And the purpose of these slides is simply to share some of the key measures for public transport and highlight some of the current performance based on monthly reporting. I'm not going to go into the detail of the reporting here. As Mark said, happy to come and give you more details about specific routes or specific areas. We have a lot of data and analysis available. And yesterday we began a weekly commentary that was sent to all members of the committee, just giving a summary of the previous week's performance in public transport, giving an overview of where things are going, and that's where you'll get the latest information. So these are the key performance measures for public transport. We focus on the measures that reflect what matters most to Aucklanders. So that's the patronage, so are people using the service, and that's how we assess the demand and the effectiveness of a service. The reliability, did the service actually run? And as Derek said, I'll just point to the definitions across the different modes. They do differ because of the contract arrangements with operators. And in the ferry space, we actually measure reliability only on the services that are actually operated. So cancellations are tracked separately. And then we look at the reliability, the ability of a ferry service to complete its trip. And then the third key measure there is punctuality, of course. Did the service arrive on time? So can customers expect it to be available to them when they need it? In terms of timeframes, we measure every single trip. We look at them through the day. We look at intraday and days of the week for our planning purposes, but for governance purposes, weekly and monthly are the best views to share because they give an overall picture and a good view of trends. On to the next slide. This is an example of the bus performance. This is a monthly report looking back over January. A couple of things to highlight in here. On the bottom right, shortfall. When we produced these slides, that was the snapshot at the time. That has changed again. The shortfall in bus drivers had reduced by 111 from before Christmas, so early December, come down to mid-400s. And last week, we've had some more new recruits join the workforce, and this drops below 400 for the first time. So we're at 393 right now, short and bus drivers. And I'll just highlight, this is broken out by operator, bus operator. Howick and Eastern near the bottom, they put some new recruits on. They've now reached their required number of drivers, so they're able to operate the full service. And to be fair, they were doing a great job of managing through this crisis, and they were operating most of their services anyway. Other things in there you can clearly see through the reliability figures. This is where our concerns are. We're facing issues with reliability caused by the shortage of bus drivers, but the punctuality measured on the services that are actually operating, that's fairly strong across the network, so we're able to maintain punctuality. We're going to a quick overview of the train performance. It's useful to split that out by lines, particularly through the rail network rebuild, to understand the impacts on the different lines. And there's no shortage of frontline staff in train. AOR were able to resolve the shortage of train managers in the middle of 2022. So what we're tracking here and reporting on is commentary on the rail network rebuild and how that's impacting services. The difference between punctuality and reliability. So reliability is, did the service actually operate? In bus, did it start from its first stop within 10 minutes of the scheduled time? And in train and ferry, did it arrive at its final point on the route? And punctuality is, was it at the start or the end of the route within 5 minutes of the advertised time, assuming that Aucklanders are willing to wait up to 5 minutes, but no longer than that. As an example of how we're tracking patronage, so we're giving an overview of both the absolute patronage week by week and how that compares to 2019, so the pre-COVID levels. Since we submitted these slides, patronage has bounced back, and last week was 73% of the comparative week in 2019. So far in 2023, we're tracking around 70% of the 2019 levels. And that's putting us likely to end the year at the moment on 62 million total boardings for the 12-month period, which is slightly ahead of our revised statement of intent target. So generally, we're tracking well with patronage recovery. So on patronage recovery, we have got a dedicated team who are working on initiatives to try and encourage Aucklanders to retry public transport, come back to public transport, and also drive the reliability of the network so they can depend on it once they do return. The first two initiatives there have been really successful. So we had the Public Transport Careers Fair in outside Britomart just before Christmas. That was really helpful in providing a pipeline of leads to bus operators and ferry operators. And we followed that up with a digital campaign that is still providing 50, 60 leads a week through to operators for them to then start the recruitment. And the mall activations is an important piece of work around getting out into the communities and explaining the benefits of public transport and challenging people to take a hopcard and go and try public transport, see for themselves how it works. Yeah, we're on to the next slide.
Thank you, Richard. So obviously one of the risks to recovery is the Q-Rail network rebuild, and back in October we communicated with all elected members in the Mayor's office around the stage 1 of the disruptions between January and 19th of March, and we will be providing a similar, more detailed briefing next week about stage 2, which at this stage is planned to start from 20th of March and will affect the Eastern Line. Details will come in the briefing next week. And we just had at that point in time, dates to be confirmed because it's so far indication from Q-Rail are that there are no any additional issues on the network that would prevent this from starting.
Okay, back to the stats. So this slide speaks to how we use the performance reporting to start to influence our planning, how we might adjust or enhance the network. So when we plan a new route, the planning team will set out an expectation of the boardings per service hour. So we use a boarding, we take the total boardings across a service, divide it by the number of hours that service was in service, so that we've got a comparable measure across routes. And we set an expectation because obviously routes have got different purposes. An NX1 is expected to be highly utilised, particularly in the peak times. But a rural service is existing more for connecting a community, and we would expect that to have lower boardings. We're not going to have such low frequency that we'd wait for a bus to fill up. So we set those expectations per route, and then each month my team, the service network development team and the service operations team are reviewing all of the routes in the network against that expectation. And what we're looking for is the route delivering to its individual expectation, rather than are they delivering the same numbers of boardings. We then check whether we are taking the appropriate actions to encourage use of that route, bearing in mind that the RPTP sets out a number of steps that we need to go through before we even consider cancelling the service. And they include things like checking that the infrastructure is in place, that any land development we're waiting for is in place, that we have taken steps to promote a service before we think about, taking steps to change a service as well before we think about removing it. So at the moment, these are the count of the individual routes and how they're performing against the 70% recovery that we're seeing across the network, and somewhere between 15 and 25% of routes are below that 70% recovery rate. So they are not returning as quickly as the whole network. And then we're digging into those individual routes to try and understand the reasons why and whether we think we've got the right remedial actions in place. And then it's just a future view of public transport development. We are still looking to make improvements to the network as Auckland returns and patronage grows. A couple of the key things that it's very important to us that we keep giving Aucklanders an alternative to the car. So we need to keep giving them reasons to travel. And we've got to address any demand shifts that come out of COVID. We've been watching the return carefully over the last year to understand whether people want to travel in different ways across the city rather than in and out of the city centre, or whether they want to travel at different times. We've certainly seen a shift in the peak travel. And we've got a project called Network Recast that is taking effect now, where we spent the last 6 months assessing where we might be able to reduce some of the peak services and repurpose those to give more consistent service across the day. So we're starting to move resource into peak services. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you, Richard. I'll hand over to Mario to cover the next item.
Sure, I'll take this. This is the final slide and final point. Just an update on the annual fare review. Members are probably aware that each year Auckland Transport updates and adjusts its public transport fares in alignment with inflation. We made no change during the COVID-19 period, so there's been no change for the last 2 years. There was a proposal to make the fare adjustment in February this year. It's a relatively small amount. The maximum for a single trip would be 40 cents, but for many trips there would be no increase at all, particularly for the longer zones. And I guess the key point to highlight here is, given the flood events and the extraordinary circumstances that Auckland's faced, a decision's been made by the Auckland Transport Board to defer any fare increase until a point later in the year. Thank you.
Thanks, team. I'd like to take any questions now. What I would like to re-emphasise is, as we're going through our current response to the letter of expectation, we are, as I say, looking at each of those points in turn. What can we do now? What can we do immediately? And also, how do we set ourselves up for change moving forward? For example, making better use of some of our transport corridors, all of our transport corridors, one of the key themes in the letter of expectation. We are trying to fast track right now for the next few months. How can we put in place some priority at traffic signals for buses as they're approaching using GPS tracking, and we'll be briefing the Mayor's office on that fairly shortly. Also looking at dynamic lanes and how can we actually bring forward some opportunities there. And as I say, communications, we feel more is better moving forward. You will be receiving, in fact, you should have already received a weekly update now on public transport performance, the driver shortages, what we're doing about that, and how we're trying to fast track solutions to that. So on that note, through the chair, open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, presenters. You'll see that we had this presentation in a structured form, in that the first part cut off ferries, then PT performance and recovery, and then the fare review. It might make sense for us to take questions on those individual sections rather than jump backwards and forwards. There will be some recommendations coming at the end, but I think that would be helpful both for the presenters and also for anyone who's watching online. So the first part was to do with ferries. So I'll quickly take some questions on the ferry presentation. Councillor Walker, and then we'll just follow with anyone else who's got an interest. I think probably Councillor Darby will be interested in that as well. Okay, Councillor Walker.
So I've got a question around the apparent conflict between financial profitability and contractual obligations, as it applies to Gulf Harbour specifically. So the observation that ferry users make, because they're aware of what's happening across the network, is that there are clear instances where the operator apparently chooses not to run. They would suggest because of financial reasons rather than contractual obligations. Do you have any comment, and do you have any oversight over that?
Thanks, Councillor. I can assure you it's not from financial issues. It's primarily, as we've touched on, at this point in time, from staffing shortages, which we're working with Fuller's closely with, and operational efficiencies across the whole network. So given that we've got a shortage of staff, how can we actually maximise delivery of services across all routes? Now, unfortunately, that means in some cases on some routes that we have to prioritise. What we're speaking to the Fullers about and the team about now is, as we look at the pipeline for new staff coming in, how can we give certainty back to customers on each route? And that's not necessarily waiting. For example, in Gulf Harbour, we're not going to put anything on until we've got a full complement of staff. How can we put some peak services back on with surety as we get, as Fuller's get a bigger complement of staff? So I can assure you, Council, that's what we are trying to do with Fuller's.
Okay, and my other question is very quick. It just goes to communications that you mentioned, and it's an example. So at Gulf Harbour, there's a digital facility that should be advising people as to what's happening. It's not been functioning for some time. How soon are you going to rectify that?
So are you saying the digital screen is not functioning? Okay, well, we will follow that up. Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mark and crew. Mark, I'm not drawn into the, I'm going to beat up AT today brigade, and I've been, very supportive of actually your initiative as an executive to really drag ferries up from being the poor third cousin, and you've done remarkably well, and there's been some huge challenges. But look, like Councillor Hills and I and others, we've been getting it in the neck thick and fast on a regular basis from our constituents, and it's Devonport, it's Bayswater, it's Birkenhead, and there'll be other councillors getting it as well on the situation we face with recruitment for ferry skills. I guess my question, Mark, is, I did raise this at the board back in April, and I just didn't get a sense that the board or management were really on top of it. They didn't really get a sense of the enormity of this challenge. So can you just give us an idea of, when did Auckland Transport grab this and realise that it wasn't just something they needed to be abreast of with operators, that they needed to grab it by the scruff and start asking operators about their retention plans, their recruitment plans, reviewing those plans, looking at what barriers you might identify that they haven't identified, looking at where people could be sourced, like did they go to Navy and hunt people down? Did they go to the commercial fishing industry and hunt people down? Did you compare notes with Bel Air and Explore, who don't seem to have that problem? Could you just expand on that as to what you did way back in April as opposed to what you've been doing of recent? Or am I being unfair there, Mark?
I'm not sure you're being unfair. As you know, being an observer on the board, we've been discussing this and coming up with action plans at board level for quite a while. And I'd like to separate very quickly out bus and ferry. Bus, for example, we had to build into this year's financial budget, and indeed towards the end of last year's financial budget, to increase to provide more subsidy, unfortunately, and to increase bus driver wages. Bus driver wage increase is a good thing, but we had to do it through government and through council. So around middle of last year, third quarter of last year, there was 2 increases in bus driver salaries, which had to be planned well in advance and built into our budgets. The third increase in bus driver salaries, which is being fully funded by government through Waka Kotahi, that I believe is happening in April. And so again, that has taken 6 months through, at least, if not 9 months, through central government to get that progressed. So certainly we haven't been sleeping at the wheel, I don't believe. It's been an extensive issue. With ferry is different though. Ferry requires more high skilled, and there's a very close-knit community industry, if you like, within New Zealand. As soon as you increase salaries and things like that, it has a knock-on effect to the rest of the industry, and Fuller's has seen that. So they have been losing people as they've been increasing some salaries as well. So that's where we've been pushing with your support and Councillor Hill's support with the government to change the immigration settings, particularly for crew. I think we need to push again on that, and we've seen some good results through Fuller's with the 10 they've identified, but I think we need to push again through that as the median wage has increased, or is increasing in February.
Okay. Councillor Darby. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of questions.
Sorry? Councillor Hills, have you got a question on ferries?
Thank you, Chair. Once again, thanks that those figures you have up there are quite different to the agenda. So it is definitely another 10, because that's a significant movement from December.
It's the shortfall in ferry.
Is it 36 instead
of
36?
No,
okay.
last 2 weeks have been reported by Fuller's as 36.
Okay, well
the 45 that's in the report, that was pre-Christmas.
Okay, that's a big move. And that 100 I'll just talk on ferries. I guess, and as you know, Councillor Darby and I think I've been on to this before the August lockdown in 2021, the frustrations for me, as I think Councillor Walker said, the changes don't flow through. If there could be an audit done every time, if there's timetable changes, because Fuller's, us, PDFs, and the on-wharf information sometimes is 3 or 4 different things. I know it's not possible all the time, but that's what people start getting. They can understand the staffing, but it's when it domino effects to not being able to understand. And Stephen was sending out fantastic, very detailed information, and Richard has last year, that made us understand, but I guess the community would be happier. And also about the communication is the port issue. I know that that was not in the plan the other day when a fuel boat came in late, but how can we get, and Roger has messaged me, so I need to catch up with him.
Communications, I think, is what we're talking about. What are you going to do about communications with the ferries?
Thank you. Well, as I just touched on, you should now have in your inbox, as of last week, a weekly email which provides more detail around the different modes of public transport and what's happening, what we're doing. If you need anything more, Richard is the guy who pulls that together. But yeah, we will certainly try and provide even more information, obviously, to the front line. The issue we've had in the last few weeks, which is why we moved more, particularly on Gulf Harbour, to temporarily permanent bus replacements, is because the frequency of disruptions was becoming so quick. Fuller's was trying to get a bus, and we weren't being told until quite late in the day, minutes before departures, what was going on. So we've tried to actually provide some more certainty back by perhaps taking more onerous options of just providing bus services. But we have done an audit internally, particularly around changes and disruptions around ferries, and that we should see an improvement in communications happening. With regards to the event in the ferry basin last week, that was in breach of the Harbour Master's direction. The Harbour Master has admonished the skipper of that, I think it was a fueling tug, and that has been addressed. So at least with that skipper, it shouldn't happen again. So we do have rules around access of commercial vessels into the ferry basin. For example, on weekdays between 6:30 and 9:05 in the morning, and 4:30 and 6:05 in the evening, there is commercial vessels are not meant to access that part of the harbour under the direction of the Harbour Master.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Hills. Just a final question, I think, myself on ferries to round off this, but then we can get to the other councillors. I just really want to question that notion that semi-permanent bus replacement is somehow indeed a replacement for a ferry service at a place like Gulf Harbour, where there is a marina that is quite distinct from any bus routes, where there's already a good park and ride. If people want to catch a bus, they'll go to the Silverdale Park and Ride. They won't go and detour down to Gulf Harbour Marina and take a bus service that takes 50% longer, at least, to get in there. So I'm really curious to know what is the effect on patronage and public confidence where the bus replacement is being advocated as a means for coping with this chronic unreliability. Because we had a presentation from the Gulf Harbour Ferry Users Group today, 1,000 people, which showed that 45% of services are being either cancelled or replaced. So their contention would be that is not a satisfactory replacement, and that in fact, if anything, it will contribute further to the decimation of what was once a thriving commute, where people actually located to that suburb because of the ferry service.
Yeah, sorry, Chair, I should clarify that temporary full bus replacement was for the period following the storm as we recovered, because vessels were going at a slower speed to avoid any debris in the harbour, which was putting even more pressure onto the schedules. Sorry, I didn't mean that was going to be an ongoing arrangement.
I accept that point, Mark. I guess my final follow-up question to that was that there was a big, as Derek referred to, there was a big public meeting up in Gulf Harbour in October, which was very well attended, where very much the same assurances were given, where people, to their credit, were quite understanding of the crew shortage, but were led to believe that there were going to be, at the very least, noticeable improvements in communications and in the operation of the service. That is not eventuated. If anything, it is worse now. I don't think I would be misrepresenting any commuter to saying that. The confidence has declined even further, and people are making the observation that, you know, that there's a suspicion that the service is being run down as a prelude to closing it. It has reached that bad. So I don't think that level of concern or anxiety has been transferred through this report. It may well be other services are functioning reasonably, and I know that is the case with some of the other providers in West Harbour and Hobsonville and elsewhere. But I would say that with the Fuller's services in particular, there is a crisis of confidence in the way those services are being run, and that as we stand, we run the very real risk of irreparable damage being done to the ferry mode of transportation in Auckland. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn in respect of a number of my colleagues that I've spoken to around the table.
Thank you, Chair. And look, we are taking it absolutely seriously. If we need more urgency around the communications and everything else, we will certainly look at that. There's absolutely no intention whatsoever, even if that's the perception coming across in the community, and we will need to work with the local councillors to fix that, about running down the service. I can absolutely assure you of that. It's all about working with Fuller's to get their staffing levels up again. As you know, we purchased 4 vessels last year off Fuller's because they could not afford to refurbish them to try and get the existing diesel fleet back up to fit for purpose, and that will help us as well. But we'll need to work through that. What we obviously need to do is make sure that we're not be seen perception to be running down Gulf Harbour as the last priority on the ferry list, which is not.
Okay, I think we will move to other parts of the presentation now. If we're finished with ferries, Councillor Lee.
Quick question. And I have, when my ferry is cancelled, I have no alternative. Can I ask, is in AT's investigations of the staff situation in Fuller's, does AT know the average wage of a deckhand, for instance?
Mr. Chair, yes, Councillor, yes, we do have this information now. I don't have it at hand, but we do have this information as of last few days.
Could you advise us of that?
I don't have the information at hand, but I can certainly provide that information later.
It's quite important, and it may be may help solve the mystery why we have, at this stage, the biggest population in our history, but we're suddenly short of staff on ferries. A few years ago, we had 2 ferry services competing on half-hour schedules, and yet suddenly there is a shortage. I would, like bus drivers, I would say that the poor wages that are paid in the industry have a lot to do with this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Lee. We'll have an opportunity to briefly speak to this matter later, but I do want to go on to the other councillors who did have other questions. Councillor Williamson, Councillor Ferry, Newman and Henderson had questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I ask you to just put up what I think is called slide 16? It's the third to last slide, and headed up PT development plans for 2023. Yeah, I looked at that last night over on the right-hand side, and I thought I just need to go to the optician, because I could not even read part of what that graph says. And even when I zoomed in, it was so pixelated, the words are unreadable. And there's an old motto: if you can't put a presentation up that's readable, then it's best not to put it on there. And so I just could not tell. It's so blurry. And on the presentation I've got here on my computer, I've just shown it to colleagues on either side. Neither of them can read it either. And it's just not helpful. Anyway, my big question is to go back to something I raised with you last time you were here, and that is to do with buses and bus load factors. I'll repeat that, load factors. I've got a nominally good Excel spreadsheet that I was able to download from your website, which has things like boardings and boardings per service hour and punctuality and reliability. And it's got hundreds of thousands of records in it by day, etc., etc. But that's not what I raised with you last time. That's half of what I raised. If I go back to the airline industry, just so that the clarity is for members, they use 2 things: available seat kilometres and revenue passenger kilometres. An available seat kilometre is how many empty seats are there, or sorry, how many seats are there, times the kilometres it moves. Because if a plane flies from Auckland to Wellington full, and another plane flies from Auckland to Los Angeles completely empty, the average load factor isn't 50%. It's only about 5% because the big long distance had nothing and the short distance was full. And what I asked you last time, and you agreed you would give to me, which you haven't given me anything, I downloaded this from your website, was some data about revenue passenger kilometres, that is boardings, because you can then work out how many, because if a person gets on at one stop and off at the very next stop, that's hardly comparable to someone who got on up in Rodney and travelled all the way down to Franklin, because they've travelled a huge distance and paid a lot of money. So a revenue passenger kilometres would be big. Someone who just went from Brown Street to Smith Street over one stop is almost nothing. And what I'd like to do is, and again, repeat, if I could get that data, and any other committee members get it, that is by day of week, by time of day, passengers are travelling in distances by when they got on, when they got off, and what the seats were available on that route. Because the dilemma I have is, if we're going to get a really good debate going about contestability of modes, where the money should be going to the Reeves Road flyover or the dedicated busway, then one of the really valuable pieces of information we need to know is how many people are using that. What is the load factor? Now, I've done a couple of experiments. They're only anecdotal, but about 7 or 8 days ago in the weather when it was fine, I went down and sat on the 1 kilometre we've got. We've got 1 kilometre of dedicated busway. We've got 1 kilometre. So I went and sat down there and had my lunch. And I counted the number of people on each buses as they pulled in and went out. And I also watched the cycleway behind me. Most beautiful cycleway I've ever seen. It's just stunning. If you want to see a beautiful cycleway, go and look at that 1 kilometre from the Panmure Bridge. Not one cyclist drove past me the entire time I sat there. And every bus had either 2 or 3 and sometimes 1 on them. And so if we're going to have a really good debate about whether you should be building the Reeves Road flyover for the cars that are locked, blocked and stopped, or you should be building, then I think that that information I requested last time and never got is vital that we get it. Now, I don't mind how much you drown us with. In fact, it makes me excited at the thought that you will drown me with too much, because I can process it and then decide what your load factors are. I really look forward to getting it.
Through you, Chair, you're right. We did commit to providing you with more granular data, particularly around the routes that you're talking about. So we will call out to your office, set up a meeting so we can drill down into that data, and you can have the spreadsheet as well. Absolutely. We do have that information, and we don't report it, but certainly we can look at that through how we can reporting that by route. What we do report by route, obviously, is boardings, patronage, kilometres travelled and everything else. But we don't necessarily report exactly the KPIs you've provided there, but we can do. Certainly in terms of expenditure on busways and cycleways, obviously under the current RLTP, under the current long-term plan, we are building multimodal corridors which include those aspects. And I guess that's an ongoing conversation moving forward, which we want to have around what are we doing in these multimodal corridors. Certainly Reeves Road flyover is happening, and if you haven't had a briefing on that, then when we arrange to go into the data, we can provide you with an overview of the Reeves Road flyover as well, which is the next stage of the Eastern Busway.
Quickly on that, when your chairman in 2015 announced they were canning the Reeves Road flyover for at least a decade, there was an explosion in the constituency like you wouldn't believe, public meetings baying for blood. Then Lester Levy 2 months later came out and said, oh, that was a mistake. We didn't mean that we were canning it for a decade. Not correct. Well, if you take 2015 and you add 10 years to it, I think it's going to happen any rate, even though they said we didn't mean it to be a decade.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Williamson. So I think we had our Councillor Ferry and Councillor Henderson.
Thank you. I'll endeavour to keep it brief. The just going back to the buses, the driver shortage, and I'm just really struggling with a few things in the agenda report. Some of them are, the numbers are a bit different in what we've been presented today, and generally in the positive direction, which is good. That seemed to me to not quite add up. I'm quite concerned that the way we're doing this network recast is sort of locking in an approach that says the driver shortage is going to continue. It was really heartened to hear the 111 more and so on, and now under 300 for the first time. And particularly heartened to hear Howick and Eastern had no vacancies, because my recollection from past stats was that Howick and Eastern and NZ Bus were the two contractors who had the biggest issue. So you didn't mention NZ Bus. That's the one that is the main contractor in my ward. And I'm also aware that through the recast, despite the fact that the report told us that the bounce back to pre-COVID levels was going better in Central and West, it's actually a number of Central and West services that are being cut during the recast, acknowledging the intention is to reinstate those, but there's no timeframes given around that. The 27T, which I'm not a huge fan of, actually I'd rather have more Ws and Hs, but I didn't want them to happen at the cost of 20 T services in the evening peak each day. So what's sort of your thinking in that space around how are we helping NZ Bus in particular? Are we effectively baking in? The finances say that you're expecting 69% of pre-COVID levels to the end of June for this financial year, which has financial implications in terms of fare box revenue. But you're telling us that we're now at 75% of pre-COVID level with still, I imagine, about half of the financial year to go. So can you marry those up for me, please? Thank you.
Certainly, I think the starting point on recast is that we modelled the recast based on a 90% patronage recovery. So the fact that we're at 73% last week, we're still within that threshold. And the intent of recast was to repurpose where we are able to reduce service at peak hours. So as a user of the 27s myself, yes, I've noticed that the 27T is coming out. Will I be able to get an H and a W? Yes, I'm confident that I will be able to get home from work and will be able to get in the morning, Derek, we're pleased to hear. So there are other services nearby. Of course, Manukau Road is well served, Dominion Road is well served. We expect some people will choose to divert to those services, but we still think there's going to be enough capacity on the Mount Eden Road corridor because we are modelling based on the 90% recovery.
It didn't really answer the finance question, though, in terms of you've got in the report financial implications that you're working towards a 69% recovery for the fare box revenue, whereas we're already operating at higher than that. I'll see if I can find the agenda page.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is at the moment our SOI and therefore our budget is built around, for this financial year, 59 million target. We're currently tracking ahead of that, so that's good news from a revenue point of view. And next year we are targeting, or we were targeting, we will need to confirm it through the SOI process, 85 million patronage. And as an internal stretch target, we have identified by end of June this year, we wish to be tracking at a run rate to achieve that 85 million before we enter next financial year. So our budgets are based around that, so there's no baking in of any lower level of service from that perspective.
Thank you, Councillor Ferry. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you. Mine was in a very similar vein to Councillor Ferry's, actually. We've got some companies that seem to be succeeding at recruiting drivers much better than others. I'm worried that we're recasting a network based on driver shortages where we're relying on private companies to recruit or not recruit. So do you have any kind of thoughts on why some seem to succeed more than others? Yeah, that's probably my question. Thanks.
Through the chair, this is Derek Copper, Councillor Henderson. So the recast is mainly driven by the changes in the travel patterns post-COVID, and the process started well before the identified longer-term shortage was actually hitting us in terms of reliability. The process started as part of a working group set up with the operators, Waka Kotahi and Council of Trade Unions, and it was intended to reduce the split shifts, which are driven by higher number of peak services. It did coincide with the shortage, and which means that when we're implementing those changes, there will be some reduction in peak vehicle requirements. Therefore, number of peak shifts for drivers will reduce. However, some other services will be operated longer in the evenings or into peak to provide more travel choices for those other people that may choose not to travel elsewhere in the peak, but travel at different times of the day. We're working very closely with all operators, and we have weekly reports and weekly conversations on their progress in recruitment. Some are smaller companies, and their requirements are easier met. Haugen East and Pavlovich are examples of those smaller operators who can meet their requirements quicker because they have to recruit lower numbers. Larger operators like NZ Bus and Riches, for example, they need larger numbers to recruit, and they are currently actively recruiting from overseas. Overall, up to 250 drivers were signed up and recruited in various jurisdictions overseas. Many of them are now being processed through the immigration service and New Zealand Police to be here and trained. So we will see a greater improvement from those large operators where they have recruited drivers overseas, and they are allocated a number of tokens, so-called tokens from the immigration service to process those drivers. So this will take a little bit longer, as they need to, as accredited employer, they need to provide housing, appropriate living conditions and training. So this will take a little bit longer, but we're reasonably confident, as you saw with these weekly updates, we are on the right track to improve the situation over the next few months.
Thank you. And I do commend the weekly updates, by the way. They're fantastic. Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Newman.
Yes, hello. I've got a question regarding this and one about fare review. Tahuia, so can I understand with respect to Tahuia, that's a freight service, is that throughout the year, is that going to be running all the way through to the Strand, or is it concluding somewhere? I mean, does that get through the network, and how far does that get through the network?
It's an interregional passenger service which is, as far as I'm aware, from KiwiRail and terminating and originating at the Strand.
Okay, so I understood from the correspondence several weeks ago that the discussion was taking place with KiwiRail, which is the operator for Tahuia, for services to allow for customers to board at Papakura to use that service between Papakura and Punui or Otahu. Why wouldn't we assume that some passengers may choose or want to access the service at Papakura and get as far as they can go on it?
As far as we're aware, they can use it, boarding at Papakura, but I don't know what the capacity or the arrangements are with KiwiRail, and what the spare capacity is on that service, to be honest, but I can inquire for you.
Okay, and are they able to travel using AT Hop, or those have to buy a separate ticket at Papakura? I mean, understanding that it's obviously it's a completely different service used outside of the Auckland network, but it nevertheless provides some amenity, some capacity for people who might be otherwise disrupted by services not running on that southern line.
Through the Chair, Councillor Newman Darroch here. So there are no limitations for customers to use Tahuia, and they can enter and board the platform using Hopcard. I will need to follow up with whether any restrictions that KiwiRail may put on passengers boarding at Papakura without another ticket purchased through their agents or their website. But there are no physical limitations from my perspective for those customers to use their train. I will follow up on the technicality, what happens if they are on board, and come back to you.
Okay, they can come to me offline. Chair, I had a question regarding the fare review as well.
Okay, do you want to ask that now?
Yeah, look, I've been making notes here and reading the presentation. So you referred to that the fare review has taken place, that there is a plan to increase the fares, but because of various matters, it's been decided that this will take place later in the year. Well, what does later in the year mean? Has this been an agreement from the board that this will be later in the year? And can we get some clarification as to when this one's going to drop on us?
It was meant to be implemented in February. Obviously, for obvious reasons, we've chosen to defer that. We haven't communicated yet to the board, and we haven't asked the board yet for an implementation date. But certainly, as part of that process, we will need to engage with yourselves. It is part at the moment of the proposed budget for next year, and there was an element of revenue which we were requiring for this financial year. So probably the best I could say at the moment is it would be later in the year, but possibly towards the middle of the year. But we will need to confirm back.
So one would expect, say, 1 July, the next financial year.
We need to also align it to what's actually going to happen long term on half price fares and discounts from the government and everything else as well.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to ask a question, Councillor Hills? Because we'll make this the last one, then I'll have to move an extension of time and hopefully go to a fairly limited discussion on this or debate. But we'll just start with that. I'll move the extension of time now. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Newman, all those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Carried. Councillor Hills?
Thank you, Chair. Just on the buses more in general, and obviously great to have the 111, that's amazing, because it was going the wrong way at December. Are you, and do you think you're ready for March Madness? And discussions last year around the rail closures, I asked about pop-up bus lanes and different ways to do prioritisation of routes around there to get the rail replacement buses turned over quicker. Is that happening? Has that happened? I'm just seeing massive numbers on the busway and on my bus that are far ahead of where they usually are at February. So I'm worried that we're not ready, or we're not warning people to spread the peak when students come back in 2 weeks.
Yeah, March Madness. So we have been able to cope at 100% of the 2019 levels. We currently have about 8% of services suspended because of the driver shortage, and we are having to cancel around another 10% reactively. So that's 18% down. We're currently at 70, 73%. So we're still within range. Even in 2019, during March Madness, it was certain times a day and it was certain trips that were getting very highly utilised. It certainly wasn't the whole network. There was still extra capacity across the whole network. And that's where you're right, that messaging around spreading the peak where possible, that's very important. That's messaging that we've put out through COVID and through the driver shortage, saying that where we are restricted, it may be helpful to look at alternative times to travel or alternative ways to travel and those options around there. So I think we can keep that messaging going.
Through the Chair, I'll take the second part of the question. So we have investigated a number of bus priority measures to support the rail replacement buses. It is a complex matter because many of those bus priorities require consultations, and when assessing impact on other road users, they were not delivering overall benefits to all road users, particularly where the infrastructure is narrow and the roads are not appropriate. However, we have delivered, extended a lot more bus priority along Great South Road. That is now in place, and that will be supporting stage 1 and stage 2 of the rail network closure. And we are working with the Waka-Kotaki project to provide additional bus priority improvements along the Northwestern Busway, which will provide additional travel options when the Western Line will close in stage 5 later in 2025. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mark and team, for a very comprehensive briefing today, covering both the PT and the storm event crisis. We really appreciate the quality of reporting that we're getting here. If you wouldn't mind, gentlemen, that's the the questioning, the Spanish Inquisition stage of proceedings finished, we'll now bring some recommendations up with regard to this item. So if you could perhaps go back behind the barricades there, you'll be safe. I don't anticipate this taking too long, councillors, but I just wanted to make a couple of brief points just to explain my seeking. So I'll move this and I'll look for a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Lee. So I'll just very quickly speak to it. I don't think it's too contentious and it reflects what we've heard today. Just received the report and the relevant actions in the first instance. Note the committee's concerns with regards to Fuller's ability to maintain a reliable ferry service and to communicate effectively with ferry users. And C, it requests the Transport and Infrastructure Committee work with Auckland Transport to clearly identify and seek solutions to the ongoing deficiency in ferry services across Auckland and report back to the March meeting of the committee. And I'll just explain the rationale for that. I have spoken to a number of colleagues who are very familiar with their own wards with the performance of the ferry services, and I really appreciate the feedback I've got there. I and Councillor Walker have got a reasonable understanding of Gulf Harbour. I know Councillor Hills and Councillor Darby are, very well versed in Devonport and the Birkenhead Bayswater services. Similarly with Councillor Lee with Waiheke, and there is an issue here. Councillor Darby made the good point, I thought, in his questioning that Auckland Transport, more than anyone over the years, has made a wonderful effort in growing the ferry services across Auckland. I think of the service of what Gulf Harbour had in 2010 to what it had in 2019 was a very strong improvement both in the number of sailings and the quality of craft. And that was something that really flipped a lot of people to commuting by ferry up on the Hibiscus coast, and in fact encouraged a number of people to live up there for that very reason. Since that time, however, the same cannot be said, and that we know we have a crisis in public transport for a variety of reasons. We have a crisis within a crisis, in my view, in respect of the performance of the ferry service, and I don't think that the public face of what that means has really been fully expressed. If you go to some of the comments, and certainly the councillors out in the wards know what people are saying, but the true extent to which that's impacting upon what are a very loyal, cohesive group of commuters is very disturbing. So I'll just finish by really just trying to give some sort of voice to the people out there, the people of public that travel by the ferry. This is one little testimony. It could have been any number of other ones as far as the Gulf Harbour service goes. So this is indicative. Other people have a similar experience almost on a daily basis from a young lady who worked in the city, and I'll just take about a minute. I wish to discuss how the services ran, or rather didn't run, this morning. After the 7 a.m. Gulf Harbour to Auckland was cancelled with no alternative options provided, many opted to take later services, including the 8:30 Gulf Harbour to Auckland that I also planned to take. At 7:16, a prompt notification came through on the app advising that due to a breakdown, the service wouldn't be operated and taxis would be provided for patrons wishing to take the 8:30 service. If the taxis had been booked when it was advised, there would have been an hour and a quarter for taxis to get up to Gulf Harbour Marina. They didn't, and it was ultimately at 9:15 that I left after waiting for over 45 minutes, 2 hours after the prompt suggesting taxi had been arranged. I was standing with a couple who had international flights to catch, a mother with a baby who was left to call family for help since she wouldn't be able to take the taxi if it had a car seat, a young woman who had a shift in town she was unable to get cover for, and many other people who were frantically looking at their watches and pacing for their own reasons. I myself had a meeting in town with my CO and operations rep which I wasn't able to make. As I talked to another man, I found the situation was far from uncommon. One person described how he'd been subject to disciplinary hearing about continuous issues with his commute, turning up late for work. As he was standing there, a man took it upon himself to call AT about the issue and was told that it was not their responsibility and he needed to contact Fuller's. It seems there's a loop situation where Fuller's doesn't want to accept responsibility for, frankly, what is an unacceptable service, and AT keep pinballing patrons back and forwards between the service providers, and we're left, quite literally, twiddling our thumbs and stranded. I don't know what to expect from sending this email, but if I'm honest, it's simply not something that should be dismissed with a shrug, as there are many people affected by this, not just this morning, but every day. We are not a suburb close enough to town that we can just grab an Uber if the promised alternative transport doesn't arrive. For many, this is our only option, and it's not reliable anymore. What happened? I used to take the ferry every single day without issue, morning and night, and the amount of cancellations and drop balls when it comes to alternatives is staggering and disheartening, seeing as I was such a champion for this service and talked it up for years. So that probably captures a lot of the people on Gulf Harbour. I hope this resolution allows the expertise around this table to work with our good friends and officers in AT who have done so much work over the years to build up our ferry services to make sure that we do not lose these patrons in the interim. Thank you. Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your work on this and your strong contribution. Then, I am disappointed with this because I have always been such a big promoter, celebrator, defender of AT and everything public transport. I do understand the massive worker issues and issues with COVID and all that. But I guess when I sent emails and asked for plans back in August 2021, granted there was a lockdown a couple of weeks later, but around my concerns back then around what is the plan? Should we get the minister here? Is it being treated as a crisis? What are we doing about this? Because we can all see when we get the abuse, people ringing us up and swearing at us, the comments and the tags on Facebook every single day because these issues are popping up. I'm a public transport user and I'm proud to be, and a lot of people are too, but if people's lives are affected so often at the moment, then they feel like they have no option. The Kiwi Rail situation with the closure of the rail came as a surprise, but it's an important investment, 330 million. We're never going to say no to that, but I still feel like we've stopped short. Have we asked for everything? Have we asked the government to subsidise public transport during that time, during off-peak? Have we asked them for help with emergency processes to put up bus lanes? Are we doing everything we can to make sure people don't turn away from public transport forever? So I just guess I'm frustrated. There's a lot of work that's happened in the last few months that's getting there, but people are totally exhausted with the process. And often it is just about how we communicate it better. If people understand what it actually is, operational issues, people just get annoyed with that. If it said, sorry, there's a breakdown and we'll send out the examples to you, or there's someone at the bus stop or at the ferries more often to explain these issues, then people feel like there's a plan. The issues that the community come to us about is it doesn't feel like an international city at the moment. It doesn't feel like a city that functions, and there is a myriad of issues there. I just hope that now we're seeing, we're up nearly 80%, probably the storms delayed that a little bit. We are heading back in the right direction, so we do need to invest drastically. But the other thing is, I also have no confidence in the fact that the areas where we don't need drivers and don't need money is walking and cycling. There are a number of projects that keep getting delayed, keep getting cancelled, keep getting politicised that could be happening in the city that give people the options to travel without money, without bus drivers, without ferry crew, that in the next couple of years, kids, parents, whoever could be walking and cycling to school, and those projects keep getting pushed out and pushed out. So for me, it feels like the dominoes are falling down and we need to try and all work together to pick them up. So I'm trying to be nice. I've always been defensive when the good things have happened, because there's so much has happened in the last decade that has been fantastic, led by Auckland Transport. But we need to quickly fix these issues and explain to Aucklanders when it's going to be turned around. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Councillor Hills. It's been moved. It's been seconded. I'll put it to the vote. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, councillors, for that. So we go to the penultimate item,